Hello. First, I want to thank the ISME Forum for Instrumental and Vocal Teaching for inviting me to give this online presentation. We all wish we were coming to Helsinki this year, but hopefully that can happen at a later date. The title of this presentation is Building a Coordinated Technique for Performance Health. Well, what is a coordinated technique? When we play the piano, the aim is to have an effortless technique that doesn't get in the way of our musical expression. But sadly, this isn't always the case. At every level, I see so many students whose playing is hampered by stiffness or even pain. But how do we prevent this? At the university, students arrive playing the most advanced repertoire, and yet so often some have pain, others have injury. They usually have well-developed finger techniques, often with high percussive finger action. But sometimes their wrists and arms are really tense, and many have never thought of how the rest of the body contributes to the playing mechanism. I used to take these students back to the beginning in order to rebuild the technique, but I found that this is just simply too slow in the university environment where there are only 26 lessons in the year. There are recitals to play and exams to pass. There had to be a quicker way. So I found that I was usually able to help the students who had injuries, but I got tired of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. I wanted to try and prevent these injuries before they happened. I believe strongly that injuries don't need to happen if we understand how to play with ease by using movements that are kind to the body. So I thought about the most essential tools that we need in order to play well at every level. We need so much more than the fingers. We need freedom in the wrist, the elbow, the arm, the shoulders. We need an awareness of the torso, the core of the body, and even the feet. And yet so many students have not thought past the books of Czerny and Hannon finger exercises. Their concept of technique is playing loud and fast. So I put together a few basic exercises designed to coordinate the whole body in the playing. Many of these may seem exaggerated, but my experience is that the body learns best if we use large movements, which can then be refined as the skill is learnt. Also, large free movements are much more effective in changing many years of unhealthy playing habits. I gave these exercises to all the university piano students, whether they were my students or not. The other teachers were receptive, and the students are now assessed on these exercises. Happily, in the past few years, there have been far fewer students having to defer their exams because of injury. We are now all speaking the same language, and we have some tools to help prevent and deal with injury. Even more encouraging is the fact that the students then use these tools in their own teaching with great results. So these basic principles can be applied at every level, from the earliest beginners to the most advanced repertoire. So I decided to build a book around these basic exercises. It's called Fit for Piano. It's an electronic resource which is the result of a lifetime of research into the kinds of movements that enable the playing to be both easy and kind to the body. Over the past 10 years, I've interviewed more than 30 pianists and pedagogues around the world. They had some wonderful ideas and many different opinions. All had much to offer. Also, there are lots of technique books. I have many on my shelves, but many of these are quite complicated, and I have to admit that I haven't read all of them. One needs a lot of uninterrupted time to digest and check all the musical examples. And in our busy lives, there often just isn't this possibility. So I wanted this book to be really simple and user-friendly, something that teachers and students could dip into quickly to solve problems and establish healthy playing movements. My passion is to prevent the pain and to enable the student's musical voice to be unhampered by technical restrictions. So now let's look at the book. Each chapter explains the basic movements. Here you can see she's just falling on her lap and then falling on the piano. And that ensures that her whole arm, hand and wrist are all part of the movement. Then you'll see little pictures of me, which when you click on them pop up, and I give examples of how these exercises relate to repertoire of all levels. And you'll also see a little piano icon. When we click on that, it has notes for the teachers to give a little bit more information about the relevance of the exercises. So it's a book for everyone. It looks like a children's book because of all the beautiful illustrations, but it's actually relevant for every level of playing. So it's not just for beginners. But it has simple, relatable instructions that even young students can understand. It's not a tutor book, it's a resource. So we practice the skill and then we put that into the repertoire. So as I said, it's useful for all levels, and particularly if you have a transfer student that comes from somebody who maybe hasn't had a great background in whole body technique. My belief is that if we get these basic principles right, then the progression through the grades is uncomplicated and pleasurable for both teacher and student. So a couple of reviews. We had one from the American teacher Irina Gorin. She says, "What a vast knowledge lays in this work. The ability to watch the videos and read the text, as well as to see the exercises, is invaluable." And for one of our New Zealand teachers, "I'm having a wonderful time trying out these ideas on everybody, from my youngest beginners to my university students and adult students. Already seeing some wonderful results in terms of freer and more natural movement and better sound quality." Now, we're happy to be able to say that there is now a print version of Fit for Piano. Well, you might say, how can we view the videos when they're such an integral part of the whole thing? How can they be viewed in a print version? Well, there are QR codes which you can scan with your smartphone or tablet to enable the videos to be viewed, and they just simply pop up on your phone. So now back to the book. First, we need to understand the basics. If we think back to the very beginning of learning, many of the old books simply start with learning to read. Yes, notation and rhythm are very important, but technique must be taught alongside the learning of notation. After all, we have to make a sound by pushing a button down on the piano, which is very simple. That tends to be a problem because then playing can be started straight away without thinking about how we make that sound. String players and wind players don't do that. They have to actually learn how to play long notes before they can go further, and in some ways that's a bit of an advantage. So if we think about the basics, we need to take care of the posture, we need to make sure that the wrist, hand and arm are coordinated, and so at the very beginning I would rather see kids improvise with one finger, getting a beautiful sound on, say, Twinkle Star, and then we can keep that initial freedom that children come through the door with. So the biggest problem in all of piano playing is stiffness. We tell our students to relax, but playing an instrument is not a relaxed activity. So much better to talk about release. It only takes 1/100th of a second to make a sound, but we don't want to keep that tension that it takes to make the sound. We want to release from it as soon as the sound is heard. No amount of extra pressure on a note is going to change that sound. And so that sustained pressure can not only get in the way of the note that's being played, but it'll also hamper the following notes in a passage. One of the enemies we have for tension is set hand positions, and I believe this starts right at the beginning of learning, where children are taught to have a 5-finger pattern and a 5-finger position, often with the thumb over white notes. Well, as you know, our fingers are all of different lengths, and so if we straight away start with that thumb in place, and especially if we put it on middle C, we're going to throw our hand into the position of ulnar deviation, this twisted wrist position, which we know is injurious and shouldn't be something that we cultivate from the beginning of learning. So I believe that each note in a passage needs to have its own position. And we need to be constantly modulating the hand, wrist and arm depending on what we're playing. So I would rather start with gestures, which is the opposite of finger independence. We're aiming to have the ease of movement, so that whether we're playing passages of semiquavers, chords or octave, we are free and able to move easily. So the most basic element we need is to make a sound and release from that sound without tension. There's a moment of support when the sound is made, but then we need to release. And if we release on the next note, we will get a two-note slur, probably the most important movement in the whole of piano technique. You'll notice that the initial exercises in the book start without the use of the thumb, because that maintains the alignment of the finger, hand and arm. It doesn't matter if the thumb hangs away from the keyboard when we're playing white notes. When we're playing black notes, it will move forward. But if we start just with two notes, with a two-note slur, I've called it parachutes and hot air balloons. We have a parachute on the way down and a hot air balloon as we leave the keyboard. If we play early in the movement, the second note will be loud. If we play later in the movement, the second note will be softer. And that, of course, is the beginning of phrasing. So we start with an exaggerated movement. Here's the two-note slur exercise. The arm, wrist and hand are working as a unit. And that exaggerated movement will reduce as the tempo increases. So if we look at repertoire and we take the very earliest pieces of Bartók, here's the two-note slur movement. Or this one. As we move on in history through the classical period, the two-note slur is the hallmark of that period. And so if we look at a Mozart sonata, or in the Romantic period, we'll have this sort of slower movement. And as the tempo goes faster, as it does in this Beethoven Tempest Sonata, the movement reduces. But the relaxation of the wrist is integrated into that movement. So of course we want larger groups of notes, such as taking three notes as one gesture. Or in music such as Mozart, at a very early level, a young pianist may easily come through the studio door playing like this, which is really unmusical. But if we add the wrist and add the slur movement to that, it will immediately sound more musical. And then, of course, we can go on to four notes as a single gesture. And here's the exercise. She's using fingers 3, 4 and 5, but we could easily use 2, 3, 4 or 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we put that into repertoire, we have it in things like the Beethoven Tempest Sonata. And we can go on to 5-note slurs in something like the Burgmüller Arabesque. Again, if we didn't use that movement, the student would probably come in playing like this, which is very stilted and not really music, but by adding the gesture, suddenly it comes to life. Now, of course, we have to learn to play legato. Finger exercises are important at every level. But one of the problems that I believe has led to injuries is that students lift their fingers too high. Last century, people thought that in order to have finger independence, we had to lift fingers high and we had to hold other fingers down so they weren't taking part. And then they'd say, oh, my fourth finger is weak, it doesn't lift as high as the rest of the fingers. Well, of course, there aren't any muscles in the fingers, so this wasn't really accurate. And in any case, the fourth finger can't lift as high because it's on the same tendon as the third or the fifth. So the fingers work much better when they are coordinated and allowed to move at the same time. If we turn our hand over this way, we'll find those fingers work perfectly okay, and the fourth doesn't feel weak at all. And there are very few times in the repertoire that we need to be able to hold notes down and play others in isolation. Much better if they all work together. Another problem is that many of our early tutor books start with the thumb on middle C. This straight away puts our hand into this twisted position known as ulnar deviation. We need the hand and wrist and arm to be in alignment for greatest efficiency and to be kind to the body. So I also believe we shouldn't really start with 5 notes. The 5-note legato is actually quite complicated. So let's start with 2, get 2 going really well, and involve some blank notes as well. So if we look at the little exercise I've shown here, we've got 3 notes moving up and down, and you'll notice that she's moving in and out of the black notes. So she's coordinating all of her fingers with her arm, with her wrist. There's no static hand position, and the non-playing fingers are able to move along with the playing fingers. Now, I have a chapter in the book called Joint Support. I believe joint support is a very, very important part of piano technique. Some years ago, I did a PhD on focal dystonia, and I found that every one of my subjects had certain joints that weren't working properly. One joint would be working excessively and another one didn't work. So there was not a balance between those joints. So I believe very strongly that this joint support has to be established in the early days of learning. So there are various exercises that I include in the book. One of them is called monkey pull-ups. And you'll see here in the exercise, she's pivoting the end of her finger on the fall of the piano, and she's moving it up and down as the monkey's pulling himself up into the tree. Now what this is doing is activating each of the joints in turn, and I've found it's a great way to make the student aware of those joints and to get them working. Then we have to be able to use the thumb. Many students won't understand that the thumb has 3 joints, just like the fingers, and a lot of them haven't thought about this joint at the base of the hand here. Also, many technique schools believe that you just play the thumb as part of a rotation movement like that. But my experience is that the thumb also has to work in some way by itself in coordination with the rest of the hand. So I have some exercises called bunny hops that help to develop that. And then I have some exercises for the 5th finger, because you often get 5th fingers which lack support here, and you'll get fingers over curling because this part of the hand doesn't support itself well. Our hands were designed to hit a hard surface like that, or to support themselves on a hard surface. But to play the piano, we have to turn them over, and therefore we need the support from this muscle on the side of the hand. And so this garage door exercise I have helps to develop that stability in the 5th finger. We also have to develop the bridge of the hand. I think most people will understand that if we have a collapsed bridge and overcurled fingers, they simply can't work very fast. And it's very uncomfortable and tense, and the palm becomes tense. Whereas if this bridge of the hand is supported, then the fingers will work really freely, which is what we want. So my little exercise is called the crab. If you watch as the pianist here does it, you'll see that she has a great a loop or a C shape between her 2nd finger and her thumb. We're keeping the hand on one level, and this helps to develop the bridge of the hand. You can do that with different fingers, with 1 and 3, 1 and 4, 1 and 5. It's a really great exercise. So now let's talk about staccato. I believe staccato can be broken down into 2 basic kinds of movements. We've learnt to fall on long notes in the earliest part of the book, but now we just need to learn to bounce. And what everybody understands is a trampoline bounce. And so in the exercise, we have a series of trampoline bounces. And in order to get greater clarity, we sometimes bounce on them twice. This helps the hand to release as it's leaving the keyboard. So if we put this into repertoire, something like this little Beethoven bagatelle, or at an earlier stage, Schumann's Soldier's March, bounce, 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 bounce. This helps the staccato notes to have life as opposed to just being short notes which are kind of static. The bounce helps that life. The next kind of staccato that I like to talk about, I use repeated notes in order to develop. I've called it sweeping, or it could be dusting. And if you'll notice here in this pianist, she's dusting the notes as she repeats them. So we use each finger in turn. And what this is doing is it's creating a movement which coordinates the wrist, hand and arm together, but it's also developing the end finger joint, which we need for all kinds of articulation. So this is useful in things like this little Grieg. It's also useful for developing greater articulation. So if we take something like the first Beethoven piano sonata and we think about the opening, if we move the finger in the key in the way that this exercise has developed, we will have really clear, crisp articulation. It's also useful for developing fast, light playing. Now, when I was a student and practicing the Chopin F major etude, I would practice it like this. But in fact, that's not the movement we need, because when we go fast, we don't play like that. And so a much better movement to practice that etude would be a staccato movement. And then to that, to add gestures. So that gesture, and then we can add it all together and we have the etude. The most common problem I see at every level is stiffness in the wrist. The wrist has 8 small bones in it. It can move forward, backwards, sideways and round in all directions. And yet many of the students that I teach have not thought about that, and their wrists tend to be like boards. So we need to first of all create an awareness of what it feels like when the wrist goes round. So this is my little exercise. And we can put that into the very earliest repertoire, something like this little Schubert. And by using the wrist, the music then has shape. You can see it too in this little excerpt from this Beethoven sonatina. If I play with no wrist movement at all, it can sound like this. But as soon as I add my wrist circle movement, the whole thing starts to come to life and it's so much more comfortable. And at a later level, of course, in Chopin. Now, scales. I haven't introduced scales early in the book because I believe scales are quite complicated. So I like to start with 4 or 5 notes of the scale rather than going the full 8 notes. One of the golden rules for piano playing is that we need to keep the hand, wrist and arm in alignment. But if we learn the whole scale in one go, the tendency is for the alignment to go by the time we've reached 8 notes. So in the early stages, if we take the tetrachord, you get this kind of exercise. Now I'm moving up and down those first 4 or 5 notes. I don't have to talk about when does the thumb go down, when does it go under the hand, because actually it takes care of itself by going up and down in what I call the wiggly snakes exercise. And then when we play the whole scale, it has coordination and alignment. Now when we talk about faster scales, it's a different category because it takes longer for the message to go from our brain to our fingers and back again than it does when we play movement of say semiquavers equals crotchet 144, that is faster than we can transmit those messages. So the only way we can possibly get faster is by playing in gestures. Now, if I take something like a gesture scale, we start with 2 notes and we add 1 more and 4 notes and 5 notes until we reach the end of the scale. And by doing this, we're chunking the information together so that the scale becomes a series of gestures. Now, if we reach the top of the scale and come down again, as we do in Mozart's K545, we have to move in what we call an ellipse. As you all know, if we run to an object and back again, this is a really slow way of doing it. But if we run and go round the object, we can do it much more smoothly and more quickly. And it's the same with a scale. If we turn our wrist to help us to go down having gone up, then the scale not only feels better, but it also has shape. In this example of Schubert, you can really see that as the whole gesture is taking over the whole E-flat scale. Now let's move on to arpeggios. This is another area where what we teach at the beginning of learning isn't really quite appropriate, because if we take a C major arpeggio and then we have to go all the way up to play our thumb, what tends to happen is that the elbow kicks out because we tell the students they have to play legato. So it's really not helpful. So a better way to learn it is in gestures. So if we take that much of the arpeggio and get that really, really fluent, and then 1 more note, we will have the whole arpeggio. The other problem is that we tell students that they have to play the arpeggios legato. And if you think about it, that's fine when the arpeggio is slow, but when it's fast, such as it is, for example, in Beethoven's Für Elise, there simply isn't time to turn the hand and to turn the thumb under the hand. So we get... I'm actually not joining those notes at all. I'm just jumping. And therefore we again are getting a gesture as we go through that. You can see that really clearly in this Beethoven sonata movement. Now moving on to rotation. Rotation is one of the most important movements to learn. It occurs in things like Alberti basses, tremolos, trills, as well as getting round broken octaves, broken chords. It's really important. Now, many technique books talk about rotation from the forearm, and yes, our arm does rotate like that. But I believe it's also important to rotate the whole arm, or to at least have that free and part of the whole body coordination. For example, if I'm playing a Mozart cadenza trill, there's no way I can play that trill if I only rotate from my forearm. I need to be using the whole arm. So I have little exercises which actually coordinate that movement, starting with a basic shake. I've talked about this as the dog shaking itself to get dry. And that's something that I think some students have quite a problem with. They can be quite stiff in this part of the shoulder. Then I have a little gesture exercise where we're just using fingers 2 and 5 and we're rotating as part of a gesture. Now you can see here when she's doing this that the little rest in between those gestures will be stopping the hand and arm from getting stiff. It's a release. So you can see that in this little piece by Grieg. Or Beethoven. And at the very earliest level, we need to teach rotation in things like Alberti basses. When we teach an Alberti bass, if we just teach bottom, top, middle, top, with a static hand position, that child is going to be stiff right from that early stage. But if we teach the rotation movement like that, and then this one, and then put them together, we have that beautiful Alberti bass. Or at a later level, and much faster, we have it in Haydn. A lot of students have problems with broken octaves. This is mainly because they tend to confuse the wrist with the rotation movement. And it can lead to quite a lot of discomfort and even pain, especially in something like Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, where that rotation goes on for some time. Now, there are two problems. One is that the wrist becomes involved in the movement and we don't need it. So if we just put two fingers like this and rotate the hand and arm inside those two fingers, then we get the idea of how to rotate without involving the wrist. And that's what we need for those passages of broken octaves. The other watch point is the fact that the hand doesn't need to be stretched right over that octave spacing. My hand is not terribly comfortable over a whole octave. So if I choose, say, the interval of a seventh and allow the rotation movement to take me across to the next note, I don't have to be stretched more than a sixth or a seventh. And that's one of the key elements, I believe, in keeping the hand and arm free of tension in broken octaves and also in broken chords. One of the things in broken chords that we have to take care of is the fact that the hand doesn't need to stay in a hand position. We can allow the thumb to close towards the hand. You can see this in this example by Beethoven. Now, a little word about jumps. I've called jumps smiles and rainbows. We have a smile on the way from a bass note to a chord, and we have a rainbow going back to the bass note. So in the little exercise, you'll see here, she is moving up from the bass note in a smile, and she's moving back, making a rainbow with her wrist. So she's keeping her hand really near to the keyboard, which makes for a very safe kind of jump. The other kind of jump that I find really useful, I've called the flip. And this combines a jump with a rotation movement, which makes it very, very fast. As you can see here, she's just rotating to get to that next note. And you can see this really clearly in this piece by Rachmaninoff. Most students will try to anticipate this chord by stretching over the distance, causing them often to miss the bass note. But it's much easier if you deliberately rotate away from the jump. The lower note acts as a diving board, sending you back to the chord. Then just a word or two about loud chords. So many students have chord playing in which they create very loud, harsh sounds, and we want not a karate chop. The karate chop is because they use the forearm and descend in a vertical way onto the keys, which doesn't actually make for a nice sound. A much nicer sound is when the whole arm works together as part of the movement. But we need to involve the whole body in playing loud. And so this little exercise here, you'll see I've got her standing up as she plays the chord. So she's learning to coordinate her back and her torso in the playing. Here she's doubling the chords. That again is to create freedom. And if we look at two other ways of playing chords, we can play towards the keyboard or away from the keyboard. Here she's playing towards the keyboard, which gives us a very immediate kind of sound. But if she plays in the direction towards the body, you'll see the sound changes. It's a slower descent, and it tends to be a rounder, softer sort of sound. We need both in the repertoire. And my very favourite kind of chord exercise is to combine the two of them and listen to the different kinds of sounds. And also to use these big circly arm movements, which is a wonderful way of loosening up the whole arm from the shoulder. So I guess the number one element in all of piano technique that I think is the most important is that of release. We need to be able to release every finger or hand position once it's played. And you can see this in this releasing exercise, where each finger that she plays is released. So the hand is not kept in a static position, it is absolutely moving up and down. If we take a diminished seventh, she closes the hand between the playing of each of those notes, so she's not maintaining a stretch. Now I just want to say one or two things about warming up. So often you hear pianists warming up simply by playing fast scales. And if we think in terms of athletics, no athlete would warm up by running 100 metres at top speed, and yet that is what so many pianists do. So I'd rather use these whole body exercises inside Fit for Piano. How would I do that? I might take a 4-note slur, and then I might extend that to use chromatics, and I might jump all over the keyboard. With different finger combinations, and by using all those different movements, I'm warming up my entire arm. I then might do some rotation exercises. Again, with chromatics. And I might do trampoline bounces. Again, I'm warming up everything, not just my fingers. I might do some arpeggios or these little gestures and so on. That way it's more of a whole body warm-up. So my belief is that if we establish and maintain coordinated technique from the very beginning of learning, and if we understand the movements which will reduce tension and program release into the playing, then we can really help our students to be able to be fit for piano and to maintain those healthy playing movements for life. I want to finish by showing two clips of students. The first one is not my student. She's only about 8 years old, but her teacher was my student, and he has embraced the concepts of Fit for Piano in his teaching with her right from the very beginning. I just love the musical and physical freedom with which she plays this Chopin mazurka. The second example is one of my own students. As you can see, by the time we get into this advanced repertoire, the movements that were exaggerated aren't really visible anymore. They are integrated into the playing. But there's still very free movement, and she's able to negotiate the difficulties of this piece with such physical ease. Further details about Fit for Piano can be found on my website, www.raedelille.com, or on the Fit for Piano Facebook page. Please like our page. And we're happy to be able to give a conference discount for the purchase of this book by putting in the code at the end of the presentation. It's available both as an electronic resource, which goes well on an iPad, and also in a printed version. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.